Hi everybody!
In case you couldn't tell, Spider-Man as a whole has greatly impacted my humor. He was pretty much my favorite superhero growing up, mostly because I was the super skinny and small of stature kid. I was also a little bit on the brainy side, which you can see in a lot of my videos. Basically, what I'm driving at is Peter Parker was and still is a character I can see myself in. Admittedly, I'd say I now identify a lot with Doctor Strange, as I've become an irascible old man, something both of my editors love poking fun at. But enough playing with our food. Let's swing into the review and see how Marvel's Spider-Man by Insomniac Games web-crawled into my heart. Please note, I will not be covering this game's DLC storylines in this review. They are included with the remastered version, so really, it is the definitive Spidey experience. I'll be covering the DLC content in a separate video sometime in the new year. I just didn't want to burn myself out on Spider-Man games because I'll be reviewing Spider-Man Miles Morales in the near future, and when I get to it, Spider-Man 2 as well. To start off, we're going to cover the mechanics, as I feel this forms the basis for if a video game is fun or not. Mechanics are always something I found Insomniac have done incredibly well, even as far back as Spyro the Dragon. Stories have typically been their weak point, but we'll get into that later. So for the mechanics, you have your web slinging, your basic attack combos, suit powers, suit mods, and various gadgets to use in combat. A lot of people have called Insomniac's take on Spider-Man an Arkham clone. To be honest, it definitely is. Batman was the pioneer, but Spider-Man perfected it. That is one thing I will say about Marvel's Spider-Man. Refinement is the name of the game here. Insomniac very much took a don't-fix-the-wheel approach to game design, though they did a lot of crazy things to make this fictional recreation of New York feel alive. If you're interested, there are a lot of videos on the channel GDC about the development of Spider-Man and Miles Morales. So if you're a budding game developer, or if you're like me and are interested in the philosophies of game design, they're highly worth checking out. But when it comes down to it, Spider-Man was more about iteration than it was about innovation. And you know what? That's totally fine. So how does the web swinging feel in Spider-Man Remastered? I'd honestly say this is the best feeling Spider-Man game I've ever played. I know a lot of people will die on the physics-based web swinging of Spider-Man 2 from 04, and I can totally understand why. That game has amazing web swinging and is still a fun game to play to this day. Of the Spider-Man titles I've played to date though, Insomniac's version is the fastest and most fluid feeling when it comes to web swinging. So much so, I pretty much opted to not use the fast travel system found within the game. The only times I did was if I was wanting to grab a collectible more quickly. Otherwise, I was just swinging through New York because the swinging was so much fun. So we know the swinging part of this webhead's adventure feels good, but how does the combat feel? Combat is frenetic and fluid. Also, all of the gadgets Insomniac Games give you access to have at least one or two specific use cases, meaning there's a lot of ways in which you can play the combat. I do have some complaints about the combat though. While it is fun combat, there could be a bit more depth here. Previous Spider-Man games allowed you to do multi-hit combos, and you had to press specific buttons in a specific time frame, meaning combat took a bit more skill in previous titles. However, to compensate, Insomniac Games have made the enemies relatively smart even on the normal difficulty, which is flavored as amazing, which is a nice touch as every one of the difficulty options references a specific era or continuity in Spider-Man's history. I personally played it on the amazing difficulty because I wanted some challenge but not too much difficulty either. In terms of that, Insomniac balanced the game perfectly. During the early to mid portions of the game, you're going to have a fairly easy time of things. However, late game can be difficult if you're either unprepared or don't use Spider-Man's mobility options to your benefits. This is where web swinging and the gadgets seamlessly integrate with the combat, which is great to see because it always annoys me when mechanics don't work in harmony. So if I love this game so much, why do I say I have some issues with the combat? This mostly comes down to it feeling way too simple until the Sable Goons show up, plus you have a constant recycling of the same enemies. For Spider-Man, this is a detractor, but not a deal breaker, mostly because the game is relatively short. The game will take the average player around 17 hours to complete, which isn't too bad when you consider it's an open world game, and those tend to be overbloated with missions and side missions, to the point they take 100 plus hours just to complete the main story. Because the game is so short, the simplistic combat doesn't overstay its welcome and remains mostly fun. I imagine the simplicity would be welcomed though at higher difficulties, where enemies will be a lot smarter, at which point I imagine you have to be more aware of what gadgets and suit powers you're using. For me, I was able to get by mostly using the electric web, spider drone, and often mixed in the web shooters. For suit powers, I mostly use Web Blossom as I just found its utility the most useful. Your mileage may vary, but I felt like you don't have to push too far beyond what the game offers you early on, at least on the middle and lower difficulties. So since we've covered mechanics, I feel it's time we discuss the boss fights. These are amazing set pieces, but I do have some complaints with them. I found for boss encounters the camera was often too zoomed in, making it hard to tell where their telegraphed moves are going to be. The ones I found most egregious of this problem were Shocker in the bank and the battle with Doc Ock during the game's climax. These were just a little bit too zoomed in, camera-wise, for me to always see the projectiles coming at me in a timely manner. It's nothing too bad, and it's doable. It's just a little annoying. Otherwise, the bosses have relatively easy to memorize patterns, so you won't lose a ton of progress if you do die. I did find the fight with Mr. Negative near the end of the game a bit of a ball-ache as well, not because the boss fight is inherently hard. No, it's a case of me fighting the boss and my body to a degree. Insomniac managed to make a very creative boss fight that ties into Martin Li's powers, making for one of the most visually striking boss fights I've ever experienced in gaming, not just modern gaming. However, this creative gimmick sets off my astigmatism very badly, so I'm effectively playing blind on normal settings. I know there is an astigmatism filter in the accessibility options, and I will use it if I ever revisit Spider-Man Remastered in the future. That, coupled with the close camera that loves to get you stuck on scenery, makes the Mr. Negative fight near the end more difficult than it needed to be. As for the final boss, I have mixed feelings towards it. The boss is an emotionally satisfying climax to the narrative that was about the relationship between Otto Octavius and Peter Parker. That particular choice was a great decision by Insomniac, making the narrative of the game more about the relationship between these two men. The plot beats then feed off of that, and it makes you feel the emotional weight at the very end all the more. See, Naughty Dog, this is how you do good storytelling, which is something you've clearly forgotten how to do. Anyways, we'll discuss more of the story later on. Right now, I want to complain about things.
I can complain about things. I can really complain about things now.
I do indeed have a lot of things to complain about for the final boss fight. It does most of what a final boss should. It's challenging, and it'll put to the test your knowledge of the game, ultimately meaning good game design. But again, the camera is way too tight. So much so, Spider-Man disappears on screen. This is something that has plagued superhero games since day one, bad camera angles. In the case of Insomniac's take on Spider-Man, the camera is mostly good. It gets out of the player's way. But boss fights can really feel claustrophobic, especially the one against Doc Ock. The man is as aggressive as I am when it comes to fighting games. The fat asshole is in your face constantly, and he's throwing shit like a toddler having a temper tantrum. For the most part, this isn't too bad, but I did have a few deaths and I did take a few cheap hits thanks to the camera going wonky and sticking to an object. As for the rest of the fight, it does what a final boss needs to. Also, the very ending section of it is so visceral and fun. You have Peter and Otto debating morality while Peter beats his former mentor and father figure's face in. It almost feels like Insomniac were using the rage Peter feels towards Otto as foreshadowing to how Peter will act when using the symbiote suit in Spider-Man 2. Anyways, enough complaining about a mostly excellent boss fight. There is one thing I wanted to bring up, and it doesn't really have another place to be brought up in this review. One major improvement I noticed with this version of the game is how Insomniac incorporated the haptic feedback and adaptive triggers of the DualSense into the game. While it isn't the best use case of the controller I've run across, it definitely adds to the experience, since you can now use it to time your swings. And it just made the vibrations of getting hit more dynamic, which is a great thing. Let's touch on my last two problems before getting to the story section. In all honesty, most of my complaints with Spider-Man come down to minor things like fixing the camera a bit, adding more characters and cars on the streets, and having them be a bit more interactive. I know the more cars and characters parts is mostly nitpicking, But like the camera issues I mentioned, this complaint, which one could call two complaints I guess, comes down to the stealth sections. Thankfully, they are very brief sections that don't take up much of the game's runtime. Basically, you're given control of either Miles or Mary Jane. Since neither of them have superpowers, they effectively have to go through a stealth section. Now, I'm not the biggest fan of stealth segments in games. I never have been, and I don't think I ever will be, especially stealth missions of this type where if you're spotted, it's an auto fail. That's just not my cup of tea. If I'm being honest, the only stealth part I liked was MJ exploring Norman Osborn's apartment building, mostly because she gets a stun gun, so you no longer feel helpless in your stealthing, whereas Miles does feel a bit helpless with his hacking device. With MJ, you feel like you have something to fight back with, whereas Miles, you have to use your brains and patience a bit more, and stealth already tries mine. Since I called MJ and Miles two complaints when they're really just one, I'll say what my final one actually is. That's the puzzles. They're just not that great, which is disappointing to me since Insomniac have almost universally had good brain teasers in the past. But I just don't like the DNA matching nor the redirecting power minigames. They're easy, sure, and intended as palate cleansers, but they're just not for me. At least with the mediocre stealth, you feel somewhat involved. So what did I really like about this game? So much so that it's in my top 25 games of all time. It's the fact the map of this game feels alive. There's always something going on, and that just makes the game more fun. I often find in open world games, they're just too barren with nothing to do, and that I lose interest rather quickly as a result. Which is why I hope we get a break from this genre of game in the near future. They're really easy to burn out on. I also really liked the story and the characters. Sure, people will complain that neither is all that spectacular and is merely serviceable to okay at best. But I like them because you can tell the team at Insomniac are passionate Spider-Man fans and they really wanted to do right by the fandom in terms of appeal. Peter's kind of a lovable loser you can identify with. Yuri Watanabe is a sassy buddy cop archetype. Miles Morales is the socially awkward kid finding his place in the world. I even liked Mary Jane's character despite some of the criticisms lobbed at her. Also, I loved all of the little Marvel Easter eggs strewn about. I won't spoil them in case you want to be surprised. It seems to be hinting at a possible Marvel gaming universe. Speaking of, Goto, when do you think the Superhero Wishlist podcast will be live? Also promote your editing services, sir.
Superhero podcast should be live maybe next week. I'm trying to get everything done this week, but I am starting to get a little bit of backlog here because I am having a little bit of tech issues. And my editing service, well, even with tech issues, I do try to get you guys' project out as soon as possible with as much completion as possible. So I am very happy, guys. My link will be down below. And Colin, thank you so much for telling me to shout me out. See ya!
Thanks for that, dude. Hope you'll all check that video out when it launches. Anyways, back to what I liked. I liked most of the things in this game. The package is more than the sum of its parts. Like I said before, Spider-Man is an iterative game, but it iterates so well as to be a near seamless experience and one that feels like Insomniac Games at their best. I'd say the trio of Spider-Man from 2018, Miles Morales, plus Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart really showcases the lessons Insomniac Games have learned from all of their previous releases. If you squint hard enough, you can see the DNA of their older games, including Spyro. But those were just some of my thoughts on Spider-Man Remastered. My final rating is a 9 out of 10. But what did you think of the game? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe. 2 of my previous Insomniac-related videos will be popping up on screen now. One is why they need to give Marvel a break after Wolverine launches, and the other is what multiplayer game they might have in store for us. Check them out, and until next time, keep blazing that trail.